There's a knowledge of God that is theoretical
Yeah.
in Islam, that, for instance, if you were outside of Islam, you could learn it as a theologian. So you could learn dogmatic theology in Islam. You could even learn the natural
What we
theology.
call doctrines.
Doctrines.
Learn,
You learn these
or
things.
Convictions about God.
God has no place. God is outside of time and space. God is simple. You know, there's no compound. He's not complex or compound.
Very similar as
very
a
similar.
classical
Aquinas
theistic
is very
account,
close to the Islamic presentation of God. So you can learn all that. But there's another element, and this is what Ghazali said, ultimately faith is not doctrine.
What is faith?
Faith is, said it's something that is in the heart that can come about from being in the presence. So Imam al-Ghazali said that faith can actually come into you in sitting in the presence of a sanctified being. And I'll give you an example. Fakhruddin al-Razi, one of the great theologians of Islam from 13th century, was walking and he had all these students behind him, and an old woman said to him, said to one of the students, "Who is that man?" He said, "That's Fakhruddin al-Razi. He has 70 proofs for the existence of God." And she said, "Why does he need proofs for the existence of God? What kind of faith is that?" And when Fakhruddin heard that, he said, "You should have the faith of old women." I think the point that she was making and he was making was that there's a difference between doctrine and the reality of faith. That you can have all the proofs you want, and many atheists know all the dominant proofs, philosophical proofs for the existence of God. I mean, they know the cosmological argument, you know, the argument from design, all these things, but there's no faith. And so one of the things in the Islamic tradition is what's called tahqiq, which is realization. And that, I was going to give you an example of, I know somebody, Guy Eaton, who wrote a book called The Remembrance of God. Guy Eaton was a committed atheist, and he told me this. And he said that faith came into his heart after meeting a man named Martin Lings. And he said it was the first time he'd ever met what he felt was a truly pious human being. And it really had an effect on him. Another example is C.S. Lewis, who was an atheist, but when he met Chesterton, he said he was forced to reassess his entire understanding of religion because he thought it was a simpleton's belief. And when he met this incredibly brilliant man who had such profound faith, it forced him to reassess his faith. And so I think just meeting a deeply faithful person can have an impact on the human soul.
In some ways, also in the Christian tradition, saints are much more compelling, quote-unquote, arguments, because they are tracked by their very existence. And once you find the way of life that you encounter compelling, you're pulled at the level not of cognition simply, but at the level of volition, at the level of emotion toward that. Would that be?
Dr. Wolf, I think to me, you've hit on the crux of the issue. I think what our world lacks is sanctified people. And I think I think in the past, one of the reasons Christianity spread so rapidly was because of these extraordinary human beings. That even some of the Stoics who watched the Christians being eaten by lions converted to Christianity because they felt that these were the first true Stoics that they'd ever seen. And I think the same is true if you study the early spread of Islam, and there's no religion that spread as rapidly as Islam in history. I mean, you can just see this in a beautiful something that was done on the internet, where they showed the timelines of the spreads of the world religions, and Islam it just goes like that. It's so quick in terms of the timeline, and a lot of it was these people. And my own experience in meeting the first Muslims I met that had these qualities that I hadn't seen before, and my teachers that I studied with, you know, the Hindus have something they call darshan, which is sitting, you know, in the presence of somebody who has done that work on himself, and that in sitting in that presence you can enter into a samadhi state, and I can testify to that truth. But those people now are actually, I think they're very hidden. We model. I mean, this is our nature. Children model. They see And this is why it's so important for us to be dignified. One of the things that I've noticed just in my own lifetime, and I don't know, I think Europe's a little different from America, but one of the things that I've noticed, just because I'm approaching my 60th decade, and I think about when I was young, how I looked at adults. And what I find is adults today are much more childish. They dress like children, they act like children.
And children dress like adults too, kind of the leveling between the children.
It's very strange. Whereas if you look, for instance, at portraits from, you know, the 15th century, 16th century, children are always addressed like little adults.
No, that's interesting.
And so this idea of becoming an adult was so important, like getting your first breeches. This was a transition for kids because they wore the shorts, but then they got pants, breeches, and this was a rite of passage. The bar mitzvah, you know, the circumcision at 7, entering into the age of discrimination. These even Aboriginal peoples have these rites of passage where you enter into adulthood, and I think we have allowed for a sustained adolescence. In some ways, Western civilization to me is a very adolescent civilization. We don't have the gravitas, the depth. The depth and weightiness. One of the things the Quran calls humans is the weighty ones. That we're a weighty species, and the frivolity, even in our language, we've lost gravity in the way we speak. One of the things that historically I think was very important to people was to speak properly. Even I mean, the wonderful Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, even though you know, it's obviously satirical, but the desire of the lower classes to speak like the upper class, this desire to when we look at a rose, what we want to see is the beauty of the rose. The more we admire it, the closer it is to our understanding of what a rose is. We have some sense of the perfection of a rose, and that's why if it has that the closer it is to that ideal in our mind. Why do we have that ideal? And this is what I feel in our culture, the type of inversion that's happened, where beauty is scoffed and ugliness is the fact that people buy clothes that are rags now. They wear rags, whereas people in rags always wanted to be able to afford clothes that weren't rags. You know, Heidegger has this concept of thrownness. That we have this, we're thrown into this world, and then we become historical products. We imbibe our culture, our ideas, the way we articulate all these things, and much of it is given to us. It's not, and therefore we come into this crisis. If we're reflective people, that I'm not really an authentic person. I'm just a historical product. I think one of the things for me about pre-modern cultures is that what you would find is outwardly there was a lot of conformity, but inwardly, and I've seen this because I've been in pre-modern societies, Mauritania and West Africa where I was, what I noted was they have an outward conformity, decorum, which they used to call decorum. We don't even use that word anymore. But decorum, it's a good Jane Austen word, you know, decorum. You know, that there's a type of comportment, the way we carry ourselves. And it's a respect for social norms, because society thrives on stability. When there's great change in society, there's always turbulence. And technology thrives on rapid change. And so this is part of the crisis that we have in the modern world, is this loss of a conformity to norms. Like cultures have norms, and they're there for a reason. But we are still individuals. And within those cultural norms, we have our own personalities. And those personalities, I think one of the things about our culture is that outwardly people are all very different, but inwardly they're actually quite vacuous and similar in a lot of ways. I read a book on the philosophy of tattoos, and one of the chapters in there was, I ink, therefore I am. And it was this idea of wanting to be, you know, I think people feel a lot of anonymity and a desire to assert themselves. And to me, I think one of the main reasons for that, I mean, God only knows really, but I think personally, one of the problems that we have in our culture is when you don't have caregivers that are devoutly committed to children at an early age. I think children lose a sense of self, and so they spend the rest of their life trying to assert and establish that. But when they're given a lot of care, a lot of attention, a lot of love when they're young, they don't need to be attention seekers